Dr. Vern Poythress is a mathematician, philosopher, and theologian. He has degrees from Caltech and the University of Cambridge and holds a PhD in mathematics from Harvard University. A prolific writer, he is the author of over 20 books.
Let's take a look at the issue of beginnings. Why is this important? So, origin of the universe, origin of life, origin of humanity, origin of morality. You could extend the list. Origin of law, origin of science. We won't be covering all of these equally tonight and in the conference tomorrow. Origin of religion. But all of those questions are questions that people ask and that are significant questions. But why are they significant? What's the meaning? Why should people care about this? Well, let's think of something, first of all, very ordinary before we get into the big issues of the origin of the universe and things like that. Think about the origin of a car. Maybe it's a particular model of car, the Ford Focus. Why would you want to know about that? Well, you would want to know how is it manufactured. You would want to know what kind of purposes are involved in the people who did the manufacturing. You might want to know what is the structure of it. How was it put together? If you're going to do a repair, for instance, right? How would I repair it? And knowing where it came from and how it was put together would help you if you were doing repairs, which most of us are not competent to do nowadays because cars become so complicated. But in principle, the point is, knowing about the origin would help you in asking or answering these questions. And who owns it? Right? Who owns it depends on where did it come from, who was involved in its manufacture, and what rights and obligations do the owner and other people, perhaps people who purchase it, what do they have? So there's issues of human significance involved even in something like a manufactured vehicle. Now, there's at least two sides to this question of origin. One is what you might call the material cause, or the how. How is this thing put together? And if we analyze the manufacture of a Ford, it would be chemical shaping of the materials that go into, physical shaping, fastening together, the structural integration of a lot of different parts. All that would go into an analysis of how did this car get to be an integral machine? What was behind that in physical terms? And that would help you answer the question, how does it fit together, and how do I take it apart if I need to take it apart? But there's also the why question about meanings. How do you use it? What's my responsibility? How would I obtain ownership of this? How would I interpret the significance of this, perhaps not simply in terms of where it came from, but what use is it and what effects it has within human society? And what are the human obligations, right, that are associated with this vehicle? Well, that's the small scale thing when we're asking about the origin of an object like a Ford Focus. But when we analyze that, on the left-hand side, we've got this area of the how questions and the material causes. That typically leads to a more scientific analysis or technical analysis that takes things apart. On the right-hand side, the why questions, that typically leads to social, political, moral, aesthetic, religious issues all coming out in connection with the meanings for which things exist and for which they're made. Now, one of the chief challenges is that I think there is abroad in the culture a kind of reductionistic move, and I'm going to label it scientism, not science. Scientism is a word that has been used in several connections, and I'm going to be pretty loose about it here. But scientism is essentially the position that says the scientific analysis is the only one that counts, and tends to discount or else try to reduce the right-hand side to the left-hand side. And that causes problems, as I hope we'll see, and some of the other speakers will address aspects of that. If we take this same picture and ask, how do people come at answering these questions, we've also got a distinction of two main worldviews. A theistic worldview involving God, and as far as I'm concerned, as a seminary teacher, obviously you think it's the Christian God that we're talking about, but I know there's debates about that as well. But that God is sovereignly in control of both of these areas. Now, human beings may be involved in the manufacture of something like a Ford car, and the scientific analysis will go down into the pieces and the materials that make up that car, but God is sovereignly in control of the minutiae as well as the overall picture. And of course, the standards for morality or for social analysis also go back to God as the ultimate source of good. Now, competing with that view and that approach to the world is what I would label human autonomy. Now, there are a lot of forms of that today, but human autonomy says we're on our own. Even if God exists, he's remote, and we're not responsible to him. We're responsible to live our own lives on our own basis. And then it approaches both the scientific side and the social, political, and religious side from the standpoint of we're making up our own minds on the basis of our own standards independent of God. That autonomy is essentially self-law, right? That every human being is a law to himself. Now, what are the implications of that? In this diagram, essentially, I'm looking at what happens if you start with human autonomy and you go from there to look at both sides of this analysis. Remember, it's an analysis really of origins and the significance of origins. And typically within our society, the scientific analysis is thought of as objective because you're dealing with phenomena out there and the facts of how things are made. And the social and political, moral, aesthetic, and religious analysis is thought of as subjective. Now, you see, once you remove God from the picture, it becomes a problem. How do you adjudicate? How do you decide between person A and his claims and person B and his claims? And one of the formulations that comes out of this is it's all subjective. That right-hand side becomes subjective if there's no ultimate standard that is a personal standard. Do as you wish. And that's attractive to some people, and it's not attractive to others. It's attractive to the person who wants to live a life without standards beyond himself. It's frightening to the person who feels, I'm not really capable of doing that well. So it raises a lot of questions. Now, with that as the background of saying, let's look at origins in general, let's look at how that works out with the origin of the universe. Again, we have these two sides, the question of the how and the question of the why, right? And the scientific analysis focusing on the how. But again, if you take this view of human autonomy, or particularly the form of materialism, which is saying matter and motion is all that there exists, then the universe doesn't have a why. It doesn't have an innate meaning or purpose. Don't ask the question because it's futile to ask it. We already have the sufficient answer, namely that there is no meaning, right? If you want to create meaning, that's okay. You could subjectively invent your own meaning, but that's just your personal taste. So you can see that the kind of answers that people are going to come up with respect to the nature of the universe depend on who do you think you are, what do you think the universe is, do you think that there is a God who's brought it into existence? Now, one of the things that happens often when people are thinking this way is that they make a kind of non sequitur. They make a logical mistake, And I call it a sleight of hand because frequently they don't realize themselves they're making this mistake. But here's how it goes. Science studies the material world, which it does. Science is good, which I think it is. Therefore, the material world is all that there is. Right? Now that leads to a form of scientism, which essentially I've already talked about, materialism. Right? The material aspect is all there is. And if it's all there is, then the question of why is beyond the pale. You're really asking the wrong question because it has no answer, or you can say there's no meaning, as we observed. Now, what happens then is that you still need to have reason as valid for evaluation of science. And why should you think that reason, human reason, is valid? So it's a problem, actually, for the materialists, and some of the critiques of materialism lately, like Alvin Plantinga has wrote a book, Where the Real Conflict Lies. And he points out that it's very difficult to give a validation for human rational powers on the basis of materialistic origins, because all you have in the end is molecules in motion. Let's see how that works out. Well, if you acknowledge that reason is valid, at least you have a justification for science. But if you start with the material and you go to a materialist philosophy, that is a philosophy that says it's all there is, then you're saying, really, everything reduces, even your own mind reduces to the mechanics of neurons and the firing of neurons in your brain. And that's all there is. So that human reason, the actual thought processes, the ideational thing, is really a kind of illusion. And if it's an illusion, it undermines science. The paradox here is that you started with science, and science supposedly led to a materialistic philosophy, though I pointed out that's a leap, right? There's no direct path of deduction there, but it's simply saying if science is good, then the material is all that there is. But that materialist philosophy actually undermines science because it doesn't give you an adequate basis to understand why human beings should actually be capable of doing meaningful reasoning that is valid, that conforms to a standard of validity. It's not just this is how people behave, but there's a standard of validity. And that is to say that there's no justification for science itself within this philosophy. So it's a kind of self-destructive philosophy, but many people are living in it, at least to one degree or another. Now the difference here, look at the differences again. In materialism, there's matter in motion, and that leads to what I call scientism. All knowledge is scientific or science-based. That's the only thing that's valid. In a theistic worldview, there are many sources of knowledge, ultimately God, right? But then God has made a universe where there are human capabilities, and all of these sources are ultimately based on God's gift to humanity of the powers that we have to understand and to have fellowship with God as well. What are the implications for science? In materialism, if there's only matter in motion, there's really no room for mind. And there are some materialists who go all the way and say basically the idea of mind is an illusion. It's you think you have a mind, but it's all really neurons firing in your brain. No foundation for science. And then if God exists, he is, of course, the divine mind. He created our human minds, and that gives a rationale for science. So in fact, Christian faith and theism in general is positively related to science, whereas materialism is not, although it's frequently seen to be the opposite of that, right? The popular thinking frequently thinks of in opposite terms. Well, what about scientific law? If there's problems in understanding the human mind on a materialistic basis, there are similar problems actually with understanding scientific law. According to materialism, it's all matter in motion. Why is there any law at all? And some of the people who have gone in materialistic directions, my impression is that this question really doesn't dawn on them. Some of them are asking the question, but for many others, it's just assumed. They think of the universe as consisting in matter and motion, but that really does not make sense without laws governing the matter and motion. Where did those laws come from? And without law, you have no foundation for science. In fact, scientists go ahead assuming not only that there are laws, but that those laws are rational and that they're language-like, and that those two features you recognize are features of personal activity, right? Our ability to speak in language, our ability to think rationally is a personal ability. With God as creator, it is God's speech that specifies the true law of the universe. Now, the scientists approximate to that, but it's God's speech that's the actual origin for a scientific law, and that gives you, once again, a rationale for science. It would be nice if we had a session here on the history of the origins of science, because many of the early scientists were either Christian believers themselves or they were deeply influenced by a Christian worldview. People like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Isaac Newton, all of them, those people, you can see how they are going to work in scientific areas with the confidence that there's hope of discovering the rationale for how the universe works, partly because they believe it's created by God, and God is a rational God, and they're made in his image, and they have then the potential for understanding his ways. That's the context of the origins of science, but unfortunately, in my view, it is drifted away from those foundations and come to think of science, and that is of scientific law, as impersonal, as a kind of mechanism independent of God. Okay, so there's the origin of the universe and the origin particular of scientific law. What about the origin of life? What do we say about that? Well, again, there's questions both of how it came about and of why, whether there are meanings. Now, as a Christian believer, I think that God is capable of doing things either gradually or miraculously, suddenly. And it takes looking out at what the Bible says, looking out at what the universe is like, to figure out which of these ways he's chosen. Both are possible in a principle, but if you look at the questions of how, through scientific analysis, it's easy for modern science in its secularized form to assume gradualism, pure gradualism, at the beginning of your analysis. That is, you assume there are no gaps. You assume there are no jumps because it's all impersonal, right? And there can be no God and there can be no miraculous intervention. And frequently that creeps in, I believe, as a foundational assumption in how scientists approach the issues. Well, if it's a foundational assumption, then it has the potential for skewing the results. The second assumption goes right along with that, is to assume that the development of life is unguided. That is, that there's no personal purpose involved. And you'll hear scientists talking about the fact it's random. Well, to say something is random is simply to say, I can't figure out a determinate cause for it. It's a confession of ignorance rather than, if you're fair about it, it's a confession of ignorance rather than saying, I can see that God is not involved in it. So there can, again, be slippage in how people think about this whole area. If I can't see a particular purpose, if I can't see a break from gradualism, I assume, that is, the scientist who's thinking in this mold, assumes, therefore, God is uninvolved, that we're talking about unguided evolution. So my point here is without trying to get into the details of science, which some of the other sessions are going to get into, that there are fundamental questions that are involved at the beginning which spill over into modern life, right? And the fundamental questions are, is there a God or not? Is he involved or not? Is there meaning, personal meaning or not? And those questions, it's easy for people to bury under the surface the fact that some scientists are actually deciding those questions before they begin their investigation. Not an ideal situation, but that's what we live with. Now, on the area of why, if you believe as I do that God created and sustains the world, he's continuously involved, and the science itself is studying the regularities and faithfulness of his involvement, then you could admire the beauty and the fascination and the enjoyment of the things that science has uncovered. And stewardship, that's really to talk about our involvement, that we've been given special privilege as people made in God's own image. But it's not an absolute rule that is subject to no standards above us. It's stewardship in the sense a steward or a manager is under somebody else's ownership, right? And of course, in this case, I'm talking about God's ownership of the world. That's a very different view of how we go about our living and how we go about interaction with the world around us. But I fear that as science is sometimes taught today, it's taught without a why, without meanings, and the joy and the significance gets evaporated out of it. So we're dealing even with beginnings of a cultural crisis over why should I care, right? If you believe in God, the God of the Bible particularly, you should care, right? Because these things are beautiful things that God has given for our fascination, for our enjoyment, for our praising him. So it's a very different view of the origins of life that leads to a very different view of how we're interacting with the world now. Well, let's talk about the origin of humanity. And again, without getting into the detail, it's the same two questions, right? How did it come about? And you're bringing scientific analysis to bear. But in scientism, in this reduction to the material, the answer about the nature of man is going to be man in general, and you and I in particular, are complex organizations of atoms. That's basically what you are. You are a blob. It's not a very complimentary picture. You are a very complex blob, but, ultimately without significance because the universe is without significance. On the other hand, the Bible makes it clear that human beings are created in the image of God, that they have, therefore, there's moral rights that go with that, right? And that's one of the things that is involved as we're struggling. There's, I believe, an ongoing struggling against totalitarianism of various kinds. If man has no dignity from outside this universe, then can't the person in power do what he wants, what seems best to him? There's rights, there's dignity to human beings that come from our significance in relationship to God. What about the origin of morality? Well, same kinds of things, right? How did it come about? And the scientific analysis tends to be, again, reduced to scientism. You are an organization of hormones, and the hormones determine whether you're mad about something or whether you're happy about something, and your personal preferences are really the foundation for morality. That's, again, a grim picture, whereas on the other side, if God exists, then he is the absolute standard for morality. There does remain something then of significance for us, and the fact that we feel a difference between right and wrong makes a difference. I can illustrate this by a couple of episodes. There are people around, I think, who have taken so seriously the left-hand side of things that they will say to your face that morality is a matter of personal preference. You prefer chocolate ice cream and I prefer vanilla, and we learn to live with that difference. Is that really so? If a person like that were to come home at night and find that thieves had broken in and taken his electronic equipment, and in addition to that, sort of taken a crowbar or something, just smashed things and messed everything up, right? So he's left with a terrible mess in his house. What's the reaction of that person going to be? He's going to say, well, you know, the thieves wanted to do this, and that's their preference, and I would rather have not that they did it. He's going to feel in his gut, this is wrong. It's not just wrong for him, it's wrong generally. As human beings made in the image of God, I believe, we can't actually get away from the sense of morality. Now, it can be corrupted, right? People can make excuses for selfish behavior, but that sense of morality is real. I'll give another example and just show, again, a materialistic concept of evolution. I'm not against dog breeding. I think there can be changes over time that God is involved in. But the materialistic concept of evolution is saying it's unguided, it's purposeless. If that's your view of human origins, then the payoff of that is you see the old lady about to cross the street. You've been evolved such that your impulse is to help her get across. But Joe over here, he's evolved so that his impulse is to knock her down and steal her purse. And if you confront him with that, he's going to say, it's all evolution. Why should, I'm just as much a product of evolution as you are. See, that it really destroys the basis for morality if that's your view.
To view this program again and share it with your friends, and to learn more about this series, these conferences, and the intersection of science and faith, please go to www.pensmore.org.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Pensmore Foundation and NRB TV.
Mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at 58 years old.
This disease just ravages a family.
It changes your life. If we work together, we can